Welcome back to the Adoption Law Firm podcast. We are broadcasting live from the Adoption Law Firm offices here in Montgomery, Alabama.
The Gump.
The Gump, as we commonly call it. So today we want to talk about step-parent adoption. And the reason why is because we seem to get more and more calls about this, I think, every week. It's become a more popular thing, which I love. I just think that that's really neat that we've got step-parents that want to step up and be a parent.
Yes.
And adopt. And
Yeah.
so let's kind of talk about that. Let's talk about what's going on and the cases that we're seeing and those kind of things.
Yeah. So a lot of our cases, when in a step-parent adoption, let's just say the father is the natural parent. He's had a divorce years ago, and his wife, the stepmother of the child, has really been the only mother these children have ever known, or it could be vice versa. In that situation, it's only the stepmother that is the one adopting the children. Okay, so the natural father's rights stay intact, and the stepmother is adopting the children. The result of that is a final decree of adoption, which changes the child's birth certificate so that now it's the natural father and the stepmother are listed on the child's birth certificate. That has the effect of terminating the parental rights of the natural mother. And in the law, this is a very streamlined process. If this is an unrelated adoption, like if this is an adoption of a newborn baby from the hospital, there's a home study process that needs to happen with a social worker involved. There's a financial accounting, criminal background check. There's all these checks put in place to make sure that this is good for the child. But it's sort of just assumed, if the step parents have been married for over a year, that this is in the child's best interest.
Okay. So tell me why this is something that is typically done, because I would just think from a standpoint of like what your scenario was, where the father is the biological father. Mm-hmm. And so the child already has that name, that last name. Why would this be something that would be common practice for a mom? I mean, really, technically, she doesn't have to do that. No one would ever know that that's a step parent unless they called her stepmom or whatever.
Right. So, yeah, I think the motivations that we see are two or three. One is if something were to happen to the husband, the natural father of the child, well, what rights does the stepmom have to care for the children? Could the natural mom come into the picture, hasn't seen the children in 5 years and hasn't been providing support or care? Right. Could she come and just disrupt those children's entire lives? And
like specifically if they're younger kids. If
they're younger kids, right? If there's not a relationship there. And so the stepmother wants that legal authority to be able to care for the children should something happen to her husband. Another motivation we see is sometimes it is, just getting that paper, going through that legal process gives honor to the reality of that relationship that already exists. We see the same motivation in adult adoption. Sometimes the children, live with their step parent and their natural parent, and they get grown and they get married and they come back and they say, my stepfather means so much to me. He's the only father I've ever known. I really want him to adopt me as an adult. And so adult adoption is a thing too. And so I think to honor the legitimacy of that relationship is super important. And there are inheritance things that go along with adoption. Sure. You can create a will to say anything you want. You could give all your assets to your pet kitten if you wanted to, but there are inheritance rights that come from being the adopted. An adopted child has the same inheritance rights as natural children, which is a really cool analogy to me with the gospel. Is that when God's plan before the foundation of the world was that, like his plan A, not his plan B, right, was that he was going to bring his ecclesia, his bride, his chosen people into his family through adoption. And that's what Ephesians talks about, is this is God's plan A, is adoption. When we are adopted into God's family, and I have this picture in my mind of this long banquet table, and only the children get to sit there, and there's Christ, and then there's all these redeemed ragamuffins, right, that get to sit there. And not only did he forgive us for throwing rocks at him and throwing rocks at his son and being ungrateful and complaining about the food, not only has he forgiven us and brought us to neutral, but he brings us further than neutral, and he gives us the same inheritance of Christ, these unimaginable riches. Sorry, a little bit of a rabbit trail there, but that is just a great picture of the gospel to me. Yeah, and so inheritance rights are another reason that step parents pursue adoption.
Okay. So there's a lot of practical reasons, obviously, for a step parent to want to adopt a child, but then there's some of it's just a child wanting to honor a step parent and do that as that kind of a.
That's right. And it's the same, really, it's a very streamlined process. It's super streamlined. You know, we're filming in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and so a lot of courts are moving to Zoom hearings.
Sure.
Or, you know, when everything looks legit on paper, they're not having hearings at all. They're just mailing us the final decree, which really decreases the cost for people. But, you know, it's the same for grandparent adoptions. A lot of times grandparents are the only parent a child's ever known, and so it's a streamlined process. It's the same for an aunt or uncle to adopt a child, is when there's this intact family relationship. And that's ideal, right? If there's parents who have died or who are unable to care for kids, ideally the extended family is caring for the child. And at some point, in order to receive the benefits of being a full child, that legal adoption needs to happen. And it's a super streamlined process.
Okay. So I would imagine that that's typically where one of the biological parents is not involved in the kid's life anymore. Does that ever happen to where there's a step parent that wants to adopt a child where there's still some communication or some kind of relationship?
That's a great question. Yeah. So in every adoption, both natural parents have to give consent. Okay. However, there's two different kinds of consent. There's express consent and implied consent. Alabama is one of the best states for adoption because it has a really robust implied consent mechanisms. Different states vary on the strength of this mechanism. So basically, express consent is put a piece of paper in front of somebody and you sign your name. That's express consent. So going back to our starting analogy, the husband is the natural father. He has to give his express consent. Now, what about the natural mother? Now, if she wants to give her express consent, that's great. If she doesn't, well, then for the adoption to move forward, the court has to conclude that she's given her implied consent to the adoption. So, you know, implied consent can be found from really she's just abandoned the children. She hasn't provided financial support. She hasn't tried to maintain a relationship, you know, for 6 months. These are grounds for implied consent. And to just quote some legal jargon here, if there's been 6 months of failure to maintain consistent communication, consistent support, if there's been a failure to maintain a significant parental relationship, then the court can legally determine that the parent has given their implied consent and then move forward with the adoption.
Mm-hmm. And it's important, I think, for, I'm sure there's a lot of step parents that would think, well, this is cut and dried and there's been no communication. And so we should just go ahead and do this and do that without legal representation. But it's important to have legal representation because why? There's probably several things that could go wrong.
Yeah. Well, market protection. I don't want people to try to do this on their own. I'm kidding. That's a joke. Adoption is actually the only area of law that I know of, maybe like patents, but it's the only area of law that I know of that courts will not allow parents to proceed pro se. So on your own, Latin word for I'm going to do this by myself, because adoption is very statute driven. So just getting like one sentence worded incorrectly can mess up a child's life, right? And so nobody wants that. And so, I think that's one reason to have really competent legal counsel. And in the adoption field, it really is, it's a niche field. You know, most of the, and this is a nuance about Alabama law, and every state differs, but one of the reasons why Alabama is one of the best states in the country for adoption is in that implied consent analogy that we just talked about. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are familiar with, a lot of attorneys are familiar with the juvenile court structure, the custody court structure, family court, custody court. All that happens in this structure that really wasn't created until the 1960s, where we started seeing the numerical explosion of the decimation of the nuclear family. The adoption happens in the probate court. So custody, all that family law stuff, juvenile court over here. Adoption happens in the probate court that has this unique historical development. Up until 1854 in Alabama, the probate court was called the orphans court. And so even words like father mean different things. How you give notice means different things. In the probate court, there's no taxpayer-funded, court-appointed attorney. You know, sometimes in this structure, there may be a family member who wouldn't pay $10 out of their pocket, sadly, to advocate for a child. But if they get a court-appointed attorney, then that attorney is tasked with representing that person's interests, and they've got a certain amount of money that they can bill against to do that. And so, the adoption structure is really intended to really laser focus on the child's best interest and kind of ignore a lot of the noise and confusion around that.
And I'm going to take that one step further, and I'm just going to say that there are a lot of lawyers that can handle those kind of things, but this is something that you do day in and day out. And so I would say that you would want to make sure that you have representation that knows what they're doing and knows adoption law specifically more than anything, and to not just pick some random attorney that can handle an adoption, but that you would just do your research and make sure you know that. I mean, we do adoption cases week in and week out. And so I would say go with an expert, and that would be Sam. That'd be my opinion. So,
well, thank you.
Obviously. So,
can I pay you to say that? I do. I think.
Not really. You do pay me, but not to say that. But anyway, so is there anything else that we need to cover on step parent adoption that we haven't covered?
Yeah, I think, let me just, piggyback on that a little bit. And I think this analogy makes sense is the medical field, you've got general practice doctors. They're your GP. Right. You go to them, but if you've got something beyond the scope of general, they'll send you to a specialist. They'll send you to a specialist. And the legal field really has developed like that. In some of the smaller counties, there may be only 14 attorneys in the whole county. Well, in that situation, those attorneys have to be able to do a little bit of everything. But for the most part, the legal field has developed into these niches also. And so, if I've got a bankruptcy question, like I could fumble through a bankruptcy, right? But I'd prefer to send somebody to a person that they've devoted their career in that issue, right? And so, we have, since day one of being a licensed attorney, we opened the adoption law firm. And so we've tried to be the best in the world at this one thing, really narrowly focused. Now, we love advocating in the juvenile court system. God's blessed, we have good success, but being the best in the world at this really unique area of law with this completely different development and progression where words mean different things, it brings me a lot of joy to help families navigate that system and do it really where we're not spending most of our mental energy thinking about, are we going to be successful at the end? Like, adoption is like crossing a partially frozen lake. You can't just run straight across. You've got to zigzag, take a few steps, jab the ice. Our energy is not spent in thinking, are we going to make it to the other side? It's usually spent, how do we do that in a way that saves our clients the most money? Sure.
And I that's a great analogy. I mean, I love that. I have a cousin who's a general surgeon, and, he does great appendectomies and gallbladder removal and things like that. But like, do I want to trust him with my heart surgery? He would probably tell you, no, you don't. You need to go to a cardiac surgeon. So anyway, that's a great analogy. And I think that, that you need to keep that in mind when you're choosing an attorney and when you're looking into this and you're doing your research. If you have any questions, obviously we are here and you can contact us. Go to theadoptionfirm.com and you can get most of your questions answered, and you can see blog posts and you can see hear podcasts and see all that information. And then if you have any further questions, then obviously you can call us at the number that's there on the website, and we would love to answer your questions and help you with your adoption journey, whether you're a step parent or a foster parent or just parents that want to do a private adoption. So we would love to help you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.
See you next time.